My family encountered a drug addict neighbor, constant parties, waking up our little daughter. I decided to set fire to his apartment so. We were just an ordinary family, me, Jason, my wife Sarah, and our two little ones, Lisa and little Johnny. But for the five of us, this apartment in the new residential complex in Brooklyn was a whole world. After so many years of waiting, cramped up in a tiny rented apartment in Queens, this place felt like paradise. 2 bedrooms, a living room, a little kitchen, a luxury we could only dream of before. Sarah was ecstatic, making our first little nest, and the kids were just beaming with happiness. Lisa, our eldest daughter, wasted no time in claiming the windowsill as her own, surrounded by her books and dolls. At 10 years old, she was already so independent and sensible. Sometimes I felt like she was wiser than Sarah and me. Pressing her nose against the window, Lisa could spend hours watching the bustling city life below, and our 3-year-old rascal Johnny tried not to let Mom out of his sight for a minute. Clinging to her skirt with his little hands, he trailed after her everywhere, unfazed by his immobility. Sometimes Sarah had to gently pry him away to attend to household chores, but Johnny would hover nearby protectively, guarding his precious treasure. I couldn't wait to settle into our new place and make our nest truly cozy. In the evenings, after a hard day's work at the construction site, I would stretch out on the worn-out couch, watching Sarah craft yet another decoration for our apartment with her skilled hands. That's what home smelled like: family, stability, everything we had ever wanted. Of course, with the move came new challenges. Our residential complex was located in the Harlem area, not the safest neighborhood we settled in, soaking up the atmosphere of the place. Lisa joined the school book club, Sarah found a part-time job at the local store. Even little Johnny stopped clinging to Mom's skirt, exploring the playground in the courtyard. But one night, our family tranquility was rudely interrupted. Sometime around midnight, Johnny woke us up with a piercing scream. Poor thing looked terrified, clutching his stuffed teddy bear. When I tried to calm him down, holding him close, he only cried louder than before. Sarah pointed anxiously to the noise coming from the hallway. It turned out the whole floor was hosting a loud party. Crowds of uninvited guests were making a racket in the corridor, blasting loud music. When I stuck my head out to reason with them, I was met with a barrage of drunken laughter and insults. Someone from the crowd yelled that they had come to check out my new digs and demanded entry to toast the new home. In horror, I slammed the door shut and bolted it. But Johnny kept crying inconsolably, and Sarah was in tears, burying her head in her hands. She was on the verge of despair at the thought of the drunken mob disturbing all the children in the building. And I realized keenly, our happy home, which had become such a long-awaited family refuge for us, was suddenly besieged by real barbarians. Sarah looked at me pleadingly through her tears. Jason, try talking to them. Maybe then they'll calm down and let our kids sleep. But I just shook my head helplessly. From the corridor, wild shouts, laughter, and the sound of broken glass continued to echo. These drunken guys clearly weren't in the mood for negotiations. Any attempt to intervene would only worsen the situation. No, I can't, I muttered, holding Johnny tighter as he clung to me. What if they get too rowdy? I don't want to take the risk. Let's just wait, maybe they'll quiet down soon. The words escaped before I could even think them through. Sarah frowned, a bitter smirk twisting her face. You've always been like this, Jason. A coward and a failure who prefers to sit back and do nothing. Her words cut like a knife. I remembered all those years of struggle, trying to achieve some kind of success but failing time and time again. In her eyes, I must have always been that pathetic guy who couldn't amount to anything. Swallowing a lump of resentment, I held Johnny, who was now sobbing loudly, closer to me. Once again, I had let everyone down, chickening out when I should have taken control of the situation. Outside, the drunken revelry raged on, and all I could do was sit and wait for it to die down on its own. How truly pathetic I must be. Sarah let out a disgruntled snort, her gaze shifting to the window where the glittering skyscrapers of distant Manhattan loomed. Perhaps doubts were already swirling in her mind again. Was it even worth getting involved with such a worthless husband and moving to this neighborhood with the children? The next day seemed to return to the usual routine. Waking up late after a sleepless night, I embarked on another round of job interviews in search of new employment. Sarah stayed home with the kids, opting to take a day off from the store. The day was long and exhausting, endless traffic jams and walking under the blazing sun through the concrete jungles of New York. When I finally returned home in the evening, I collapsed wearily onto the old couch. My legs ached, and my head spun from a million impressions and empty promises from employers. Sarah was whispering something softly to the children in the adjacent room, getting them ready for bed. For once, there was a long-awaited silence and peace. Maybe today we would finally get a good night's sleep. However, closer to midnight, the noise from the corridor began to escalate. At first, it was just distant voices and laughter, but soon they were joined by familiar sounds, the stomping of many feet, the crashing of something being broken, and drunken shouts. I groaned, covering my face with my hand. Not again. Uninvited guests, another noisy party, and a horde of drunkards in the hallway. Sarah didn't even poke her head out of the children's room. She must have resigned herself to the inevitable repetition of the nightly nightmare and no longer expected anything from me. But this time something clicked inside. I couldn't let these riffraff destroy our family's comfort and deprive the children of sleep again. I had been timid for too long, instead of taking action. It was time to finally act like a man and stand up for my family. Clutching my fists, I abruptly rose from the couch and strode decisively to the door. The corridor was in chaos, the revelry was escalating. But this time, I was determined to put an end to this disgrace. No matter what it took, I stepped into the corridor. Ignoring the drunken insults hurled at me, the mob of thugs had already begun to kick down apartment doors, laughing loudly and breaking locks. Someone tried to barricade themselves from inside, but to no avail. Suddenly, cries for help came from the neighboring apartment. I froze, listening intently. It seemed that part of this drunken horde had already infiltrated there. Then came the heart-wrenching cry of a child. Without hesitation, I rushed to the neighbor's door, smashing it with my shoulder. I burst inside. Before me lay a horrifying scene. Thugs, dressed like hooligans, were grabbing and trying to drag out a young woman and her 5-year-old daughter from the apartment. The poor girl clung to her mother, crying out loud, "Hey, guys, have you lost your minds?" I yelled, lunging at the attackers. "Let them go now." A terrible scuffle ensued. I took a few heavy blows, but I didn't back down. The main thing was that I managed to push back the thugs, escort the woman and child out of the apartment, and slam the door shut. The corridor instantly filled with screams and curses. But I stood like a rock, shielding the battered family and preventing the rampaging gang from getting any closer. At the same time, other residents, peering out of their apartments, also began to stand by my side. In that horrific brawl, everyone got involved. I took a few punches myself, and one of the thugs even tried to hit me with a bottle, but I managed to dodge it. I gave those scoundrels a taste of their own medicine, but most importantly, I managed to push them away from the defenseless woman and child, escort the battered family out of the apartment, and slam the door shut. The corridor turned into a real hell. Cries, shouts, threats. But I stood up for the neighbors, not letting the rampaging gang get any closer. At the same time, other residents, peering out of their apartments, also began to stand by my side. Someone called the police, someone threatened the thugs with their fists. Seeing their numerical advantage diminishing and the situation spiraling out of control, the gang leaders cursed disappointedly and ordered a retreat. After receiving a couple of threatening, "We'll be back" remarks directed at me, the whole drunken horde finally retreated, leaving behind a devastated corridor. I breathed a sigh of relief and turned to the neighbors. The woman, still clutching her sobbing daughter, nodded gratefully to me. Tears of relief filled her eyes. It seemed that after what happened, she realized that her husband stood up not only for them but for all of us, risking his own life. Her husband also glanced at me, full of respect and gratitude. Suddenly, Sarah burst out of the neighboring apartment. She ran to me, embraced me, and kissed my bruised cheeks. Apparently, watching this epic scene from the window, my wife realized that her eternal loser was actually a real man capable of protecting his family. That night, I was literally a hero to our loved ones. But the greatest reward for me was Sarah's happy face, which finally saw what her seemingly powerless husband was capable of when his family was in danger. However, I couldn't help feeling uneasy every time I had to leave the apartment. Entering the lobby of the residential complex or leaving the building, I looked around, expecting a possible ambush. What if those scumbags came back and decided to take revenge? Their threatening words about coming back echoed in my ears. I would often startle at any noise in the hallway, instinctively clenching my fists. Sometimes, in the dark corners or behind the columns, would see moving shadows. My heart would race as I hurried past. Sarah would cast worried glances at me, but I would just wave her off, attributing it to fatigue from work. In reality, I was just afraid to admit that my nervous system had been seriously shaken after that incident. "Oh, come on, it's just your paranoia," I would tell myself as I stepped outside. "They were just scared after you stood up for the neighbors." I would glance back, peering into the alleyways and windows of the buildings. But there was no sign of that drunken gang anywhere, just the bustling life of the big city swirling around me in its routine cycle. "See, you're just getting worked up for no reason," I would reassure myself. They moved on and forgot about our apartment building. Their threats were just the bravado of alcohol-fueled brains. Yet, as I delved deeper into the crowds of New York, I couldn't shake off the oppressive feeling that someone was stalking me, watching me. It was just a delusional paranoia born in my head after the stress I went through one evening. Returning from work, I stepped into the lobby elevator. And right from behind the closing doors, one of those thugs stared at me, the same one I gave a good beating during the scuffle. A massive bruise was clearly visible under his eye. Our gazes met for just a moment, but it felt like time literally stood still. This thug recognized me, and I recognized him. Before the elevator doors closed completely, he managed to shoot me a hateful, venomous look. I froze in horror, chilled to the bone. So, this was where that gang dwelled. Right above my head, on the neighboring floor, their threatening words during that night's brawl came rushing back to me. And here I thought they had simply moved away from the residential complex. With trembling hands, I pressed the elevator call button, continuing to stare blankly at the closed doors. Inside, I felt a primal fear gripping me, imagining how these thugs could storm in at any moment and wreak havoc. I descended into a full-blown panic. Arriving at the apartment, I collapsed on the couch, completely drained, holding my head in my hands. Sarah immediately bustled around, trying to comfort me and ask what happened. But I just silently shook my head, unable to share my fears. From that moment on, there was no more peace in the lobby. I would nervously twitch at every exit from the apartment, startled by any noise. In those days of endless stress and paranoia, we found unexpected acquaintances in our residential complex. A chance conversation by the trash chute with an elderly couple turned into an invitation to their apartment for a cup of tea. The Johnson family, Philip and Martha, had been living here for many years. They remembered when this neighborhood was a quiet and peaceful place. So, my stories about that drunken mob running wild in the hallways at night greatly alarmed them. "Yes, it all started with the arrival of that new crowd on the upper floors," nodded gray-haired Philip, pouring us tea. "Sons of some big shots, moneybags in their early 20s, have you heard? Their daddy is a big businessman in Manhattan," added Martha. "He even rented separate apartments for his offspring in our building to live closer to the city center." I felt my throat go dry. Could it be that the gang of thugs who forced me into that nighttime brawl were actually from affluent families? Of course, the boys quickly got a taste for lawlessness, continued Philip, catching my astonished gaze. "Loud parties, drinking, drugs, just like the Golden Youth." The management company tried to calm them down, but after a few calls to their parents, they quickly backed off. Martha clicked her tongue sadly. So much money, wealth, but the kids grew up to be nothing but thugs. A couple of months later, they felt completely untouchable within these walls. So, these were the ones who orchestrated that drunken revelry in the hallway and attacked my family. The sons of fat cats, for whom the concepts of morality and law were empty words. The management company had long given up, fearing the wrath of influential daddies. Remembering the hateful glare of that hooligan with the bruise in the elevator, I shuddered. These wealthy degenerates were surely already plotting revenge for that night's brawl. And if even the management company couldn't calm them down, what chance did I have, just an ordinary worker without connections or capital? After visiting the Johnsons, I became even more nervous and scared of any noise behind the door. Night after night, I tossed and turned, listening for the slightest sounds from the upper floors. And during the day, I nervously clenched my hands with every exit from the apartment. Who knows what other atrocities their sick minds might unleash? A sharp knock on the door woke us up. I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding wildly. Shouts and stomping could be heard in the hallway. I cautiously peeked through the peephole and froze. Police officers were standing in the corridor with their weapons drawn. "Open up, police," a gruff shout rang out. I looked at Sarah in shock. What was happening? I had no choice but to open the door. The cops burst into the apartment, shoved me to the floor, and began searching. Sarah was screaming, the children were crying. "Where are the drugs? Tell me where you're hiding them." One of the cops pointed his gun at me. I tried to explain that it was some kind of mistake, but they weren't listening. After searching the entire apartment, they swore that they hadn't found anything, but they had been tipped off that I was dealing drugs. After the search, I was roughly shoved into the police car. I tried to explain that it was a misunderstanding, but the cops just smirked maliciously at the station. they threw me into an interrogation room. Endless interrogations with shouts and threats began. The cops were convinced I was a major drug dealer and tried to beat a confession out of me by any means necessary. I desperately insisted it was a setup, that I didn't have any drugs, but they just mocked me. Come on, don't pretend. We've been told everything, we know you're running your business here. They didn't let me out of the interrogation room for 2 days, barely letting me sleep or eat. Periodically, screams could be heard from the neighboring rooms. It was obvious that the cops were intimidating other detainees this way. I was mentally and physically exhausted. My thoughts were muddled. Everything was blurry before my eyes from lack of sleep. At one point, I was ready to simply incriminate myself, just to end this nightmarish torment. Finally, after endless cycles of interrogation, I was summoned to the chief. He looked at me coldly and hissed, "Okay, we'll let you go for now, but know this, we'll keep watching you. Don't take a single wrong step." They released me with nothing. Returning home, I felt emptiness and hopelessness. It was now clear, this was a planned action by the gang of rich scions. For them, it was just entertainment, to intimidate and torment ordinary people. After the nightmare I had endured, a thirst for righteous revenge boiled inside me. These spoiled brats had become completely arrogant, feeling their impunity, but I decided to put an end to it. At first, I tried to gather evidence against them. I recorded their nightly rampages on a dictaphone, captured traces of their vandalism in the hallways on my phone's camera, but I quickly realized that legal methods wouldn't work here. The cops had been bought off by the influential dad, so I abandoned that effort and focused on teaching the hooligans a lesson myself. Tracking their movements, I found out exactly where the guy with the bruised face from the elevator, the gang leader, lived. One night, when he and his buddies were getting ready for another party, I sneaked into his place first. I doused the entire place with a flammable liquid, then I scattered some stolen bags of drugs around, and finally, I set the apartment on fire. Quickly retreating, the wail of the fire alarm and the arrival of the firefighters woke the whole building. And when the cops discovered traces of drugs and signs of a drug den in the charred apartment, it was the last straw. The hooligan and his buddies were arrested right on the doorstep of their lair. The scion of an influential father was charged with illegal drug trafficking and threatening behavior. After this scandal, his family had no choice but to urgently move out of our building. With the leader gone, his whole gang quickly dispersed and scattered. Our residential complex regained its long-awaited peace and quiet. We all breathed a sigh of relief after this nightmarish bacchanalia. Finally, the measured, peaceful life we had been waiting for. After the move had begun,